Got it. Okay, it should be doing that now.
Perfect. Okay, carry on.
Okay, sorry about that. Didn't know I was supposed to do that. So if you look at the port's role in Alaska, we really have three basic functions. The first function is commerce. That's the basic business of shipping goods into the port and then distributing them to the state for, for people to eat, for businesses to use, that sort of thing. All the normal things that you think of with a port. Our second real line of work or line of business is national defense. We are a Department of Defense designated strategic port. That means that we have to be able to provide certain abilities or capabilities to the Department of Defense in case of, well, basically to support all of their operations in Alaska, throughout the Pacific Rim, and in the Arctic. And then we have a resiliency mission or a disaster recovery mission. And that's both a federal, for instance, FEMA, and state for the State Department of Homeland Security. Basically, if we have another 1964 type event, every drill that's been run relies upon the Port of Alaska functioning in order to have a successful or a satisfactory disaster recovery and disaster response. If we look more closely at our commerce role, which you should be looking at right now is actually cement inside of a cement ship. And that guy that you see walking along the deck there, he played far too many video games when he was a kid. That thing in his hands is a joystick. And for about 2 weeks, he sits there and uses that joystick to operate that giant vacuum cleaner that you see hanging down into the cement to offload the cement into the big dome we looked at earlier. It's quite the process. And if you look at cement, we bring 90% of the cement used in the state of Alaska comes across our dock and into our facility. And from there, if you look at the three biggest cement using projects in the state right now, most of that cement's getting loaded onto rail cars and brought up to Fairbanks because the #1 cement user this year is the Liberty Energy project up off of the North Slope, that island that Hillcorp and BP and ASRC are building as an oil platform. The second biggest one I'm sure you're familiar with, Eielson Air Force Base, F-35 infrastructure. And the third biggest cement user this year is Pogo Gold Mine. So even though it's coming across Port of Alaska, it is directly impacting economic development projects in other parts of the state. Another example of how we impact everybody, well, 85% of all Alaskans regularly use goods shipped across our dock. By regularly, the researchers said at least once a week. So that could be food, that could be fuel, all sorts of things. A good example would be methanol. You go, okay, methanol, what's that for? Well, when you go to Fred Meyer and you buy your that blue windshield wiper fluid that keeps your windshields clean during the wintertime when it's cold, that's got methanol in it that comes across our dock. But the real use is it goes up to the North Slope and into Cook Inlet to go downhole in the oil fields so that they can maintain winter production. It also goes in the pipelines to keep the pipelines from freezing in the wintertime. Another part of our commerce mission is that we are actually Foreign Trade Zone number 160. That provides a number of import benefits or import tariff benefits that make Alaska businesses more competitive. The biggest user of those benefits is Ted Stevens International Airport, and the fact that we can sell tariff-free fuel to international cargo freighters, and that significantly reduces the cost of flying into and out of Alaska and attracts a lot of container business to the state, air container business to the state. Our national defense mission, as I said, we are a U.S. Commercial strategic seaport that supports the DoD missions in Alaska, the Pacific Rim, and the Arctic. About 20% of all the cargo that crosses our dock is military related. The trick with being a strategic port is it's a lot more than just the day-to-day cargo shipping. we have to be able to provide a certain amount of resource in the event of a national emergency. So for example, if they decided they were going to deploy to North Korea, most of the deployment would go across our dock, and DoD expects us to have at least 2,200 horizontal feet of cargo dock and 25 acres of cargo yard that we can have available on less than a week's notice for them to take over in the event of a deployment. The problem is this is really an uncompensated service that we're providing, because we do not get any additional cash for having the ability to provide this facility. We only get paid for the tonnage that actually crosses the dock. As far as our natural disaster response, recovery, resiliency mission, the Port of Alaska is a key piece of the disaster recovery plan for FEMA, for Homeland Security. They routinely run drills, and every time they do it, the drill fails as soon as the port is closed. I've had a lot of people tell me, well, what's the big deal? If the port closes, we'll just use aviation, or we'll fly goods in and we'll feed the people that way. The trick is, Alaska is a just-in-time delivery state. We don't have a whole lot of warehousing in Alaska. And the state has a 7 to 10 day supply of food if the Port of Alaska closes. After that, you would have to replace it probably with airlift. Keep in mind that if we have an event that's big enough to close the Port of Alaska, you've probably compromised most of the other ports in South Central Alaska. In order to replace the freight that comes in our container ships every week, it would take about 700 wide body cargo flights, like 747s, per week to replace what we bring in ships. To put that number in perspective, the airport right now handles, which is, Ted Stevens International Airport is, depending on which numbers you look at, the fourth or fifth busiest cargo airport in the world. They handle about 500 wide body flights a week now. And we would need 700 additional flights in order to replace the cargo capacity that Port of Alaska handles. Not going to be an easy thing to do. So here's our challenge. The port is now over half a century old. We have 1,423 hollow steel wharf piles that the port is built on. And if you listen to the engineering reports, most of those piles have lost about 3/4 of their original thickness near the mud line. And we are within 10 years of failing because the port will not be able to sustain loads. We have a routine maintenance. We spend about $3 million a year putting, if you look on the right side of your screen, you see the jackets on the piles. So we've been putting jackets on piles since 2006 is when that program started, but those pile jackets only last for 10 to 15 years. So if you do the math, 10 to 15 years on top of 2006, we are rapidly closing in on the date when we're going to have to start closing docks because they will not have the load bearing capacity to handle the loads of offloading ships. The port has long exceeded its original design life. Under original construction, which did not include modern seismic standards, the port was expected to last about 35 years. And keep in mind that the docks were built for 1960s and 70s era ships and cargo handling technologies that were, the ships were a lot smaller and their cargo handling technologies were a lot different than they are today. So we're a relatively inefficient port these days. We have a Port of Alaska modernization plan or program. And a key piece of this to keep in mind is that it is not an expansion program. It's basically a dock replacement program to replace the infrastructure that we have. It will not expand our docks in any significant fashion. Right now, our docks are operating at about 35% capacity. Best practices among port experts is that when a dock is at 70% capacity, then you start thinking about building a new dock or an additional dock because you're starting to run into operational inefficiencies. But at 35% capacity, we could effectively double the state's population and still have plenty of dock, assuming that it was in good working order. And here's where I suspect you're going to want to start having a conversation. So the Port of Alaska modernization program, we really started construction this summer. If you look in this picture, you can see they're doing shoreside stabilization work. They're basically hardening up the shore where the trestle for a new petroleum and cement terminal is going to go. The whole project is real, or the whole program actually encompasses a number of projects. So when you hear people talking about the port modernization plan, you'll hear different numbers getting thrown out. Well, keep in mind that the numbers vary because it depends on which parts of or which projects you're including. And I'll get into the various projects in a minute. The real thing to remember is what we're aiming to do is replace the infrastructure that we have now with more or less the same infrastructure built to modern standards. The new dock will be optimized to reduce operational costs and construction costs. A lot of even though we're not going to have more dock, we will actually expand our capacity because, for example, right now the current cement terminal is about 2,300 feet from the cement dome that you see in this picture. The new one will be less than 800 feet from the dome. That will change our cement offloading time from, it takes about 2 weeks for a ship to offload cement right now. When you move it closer, that offload time will drop down to about a week. So even though we won't have more dock, just the fact that we've built it in a more logical fashion will make it more efficient. And peak construction is expected to take about 300 construction workers on the ground while we're building. So the entire project is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 billion, and that's everything. But that project is a really, well, we'll get into the number in a minute. The cost drivers on the project, an Alaska dock, as you guys are familiar, is going to cost more than a similar project in the lower 48 for a number of reasons. First of all, we are a long way away from a lot of the resources that will be needed to construct the dock. For instance, I'll have to bring the barge-mounted cranes up from the West Coast. We have a short construction season. We have extreme conditions. You know, for instance, Upper Cook Inlet has silt that's hundreds of feet deep. We have up to a 40-foot tide fluctuation. We're in a high seismic hazard area, and then we have the climate conditions, for instance, the ice that flows back and forth in the wintertime. We also have to keep the dock open and fully operational throughout construction. Something about people like to eat. I don't know how that works, but you know, figure that one out. And then we have endangered sea mammals. The commercial scope of this project is going to be driven by the user demand. So we've thrown out what we think the project ought to be, and we've got users telling us, nope, we want this, or yes, we want that. And that is going to drive the final price of the project. Unfortunately, we have two users who are putting some significant demands on the project that are not actually going to be generating revenue. One would be Department of Defense, and then the other would be the resiliency folks. The other big challenge we have is how we're going to pay for this. If we were at a typical lower 48 facility, the way a port would say, Port of Tacoma would build a new dock is they would say, okay, we're going to go out and get revenue bonds, and then we are going to charge a tariff for all the cargo that comes across the dock to pay for the dock. The nice thing about a place like Tacoma is they have both inbound and outbound freight. So right off the bat, about half of that tariff is going to be charged to people who don't live in Washington State. They live in places like Alaska or in Asia. And then of their inbound cargo, you know, in the case of Tacoma, more than half, actually close to 60% of their cargo continues eastward and ends up in places like Kansas City and Omaha. So that at the end of the day, less than a quarter of the cost of that dock is being borne by Washington residents. In the case of Alaska and the Port of Alaska, virtually all of our freight is inbound, and then all of the freight that comes into the state stays in the state. That means it's going to come out of the pockets of Alaskans, of Alaska residents, Alaska businesses. The other big challenge we have from a cost perspective is, as far as the DoD needs and the amount of dock they need, if we are in the lower 48, if you're the Port of Seattle and you're a strategic port and they want, say, 2,000 or 2,200 feet of dock, well, you've got 2,200 feet of dock that you need for your daily duty. And in the event of a national security or a national defense mission, you just tell that other business, hold off, go to another port, we need to deal with DoD today, and you use your regular docks. In our case, where we're operating at 35% capacity, DoD wants us to have a lot more dock than we use on a daily basis. So that means we have a lot of dock that's sitting there unused that has to be paid for, and you're not generating any revenue when you're not using the dock. So that's our big cost challenge. So then the next question becomes...
Actually, Jim, before you go,
before
you go on, you mentioned the resiliency folks.
Mm-hmm.
You speak to that?
Well, the resiliency folks, we have both federal and state officials that use Port of Alaska as in their resiliency mission. So FEMA is the primary federal agency, and then Alaska's Department of Homeland Security is the primary state agency for disaster response. And they're basically all assuming that if we have that next 1964 earthquake and ports and roads and rail systems are compromised, they are going to bring most of the goods for the state across our dock. Our dock is tsunami proof. It's really the only inbound cargo port in South Central Alaska that is in a tsunami proof region. Our challenge is, if you look at this picture right here, when the 1964 earthquake hit, you see all that construction and all those containers and all that stuff that's up on shore. That was all mud flat in 1964. That mud flat is about 80 vertical feet higher than where the ships are parked, the berths there and at the front of the dock. So that dock at low tide has ship berths that are at least 35 feet deep. If we have another 64 event, the big danger is liquefaction. So the silts turn to liquid. Liquids flow. You're going to have all that stuff up on top of the silt that's turning to liquid. Liquids tend to flow downhill, so all of that stuff is 80 vertical feet higher than the ship's berth. Basically, what's going to happen is the natural flow is all that material will flow down through the wharf piles and into the ship berth and close the docks. It'll probably sweep the legs of the dock out from underneath it at the same time, and the port will be closed for years. Does that sort of paint the picture for you?
Yeah, right.
And as I said, the big challenge is, you can see Jager's runway there in the background. The big challenge is to replace our weekly inbound cargo load. It would take the equivalent of 700, 747 landings per week. Do you even want to talk about how expensive that would be? It's not sustainable.
But the modernization isn't going to change that specific problem in terms of liquefaction.
Well,
right?
no. What it would do is the new dock, there are now seismic standards, and engineers have a much better handle on how to construct for the seismicity. So, for example, the wharf piles that are underneath today's dock, the longest ones are driven 60 to 70 feet into the silt. we did a test pile program 2 years ago where we drove 10 piles up and down the port area to figure out how deep we had to go in order to hit what's called point of refusal. It's basically putting it down into solid, stable material. At the south end of the port, so the right end of this photograph, the shallowest piles we drove had to go 135 feet until they hit point of refusal. At the north end, up there by that tote vessel, they had to go 188 feet till they hit point of refusal. So basically what the idea is with the new dock, the piles will be driven somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 times as deep as the current piles, and the bottoms of those piles will be locked into solid material, so that if we do have that liquefaction event and the muds and silts start flowing through the piling, they won't get swept out. They'll stay stable.
Yeah, I have a question, Jim, on on the financing of this thing. You stated that DOD does not contribute any funding.
That's correct. And that's not only with us, that's with strategic ports across the country. Most strategic ports, the one benefit they get from being a strategic port is the Corps of Engineers picks up their dredging costs. At Port of Alaska, the Corps of Engineers picks up our dredging costs, but not because of our DOD status. It's because of a separate law that Ted Stevens got passed decades ago.
Are there any federal funds that are contributed?
No, basically, we got some federal funds for the port expansion project. That was that project from back in the early 2000s that I think it would be fair to describe it as an utter failure. And so there was federal money that came for that. The idea with that project was they were going to replace our wharf on piles with a sheet pile wall that it was just unconstructable. It is not the proper technology for our soils. It was a failure on about 6 different fronts. And I'm not going to speculate what the real problem was. That's in litigation right now. All we know, though, is that they were trying to rebuild the docks back in the early 2000s because of this corrosion problem. And, the problem has only gotten 20 years worse or 15 years worse.
One other question. Has there been a concerted effort at all to try to get DOD to come up with any money? Because, as you well know, the state of Alaska has not enticed DOD to come into the state of Alaska. The military and the federal government has strategically sought Alaska out as a base for many operations. So it seems to me that if there were a concerted effort to try to get DOD funds, it might bear fruit.
Well, we have made an effort. I regularly talk with members of the delegation. For instance, I had several people from Don Young's office in our office just last week. I've talked with members of all 3 delegations offices we've had on port within the past 2.5 months. Both Lisa Murkowski and Don Young have been on the port this summer. So, I mean, they're very familiar with the issue. I have had a constellation worth of stars on the collars of generals and admirals at our office. Every single one of them instantly gets and understands the strategic importance of this facility. The problem is DOD does not have a mechanism for funding commercial ports. So if we were a military port, piece of cake. They can get money for that. But for a commercial port that the military uses, they do not have a funding mechanism. So basically, we're going to have to come up with some other way to get federal money in. It's not going to come directly through DOD, or probably not going to. If I need a letter from a general to support the project, I can have 6 letters in a week. I mean, they get it. The problem is what's the mechanism you use?
Thank you, Jim.
So, to your point, let me break the costs down. Okay, so when I throw out $1 billion number, that number is is a bit of a subjective number because I don't know exactly what I'm building. We have a chicken or egg problem here. I can't determine the final project cost without knowing exactly what the project scope is. And I can't know what the final project scope is until I know what the funding sources are, because I'm going to build to the needs of the funders. So for example, I have Tote telling me what they need, and I have Matson telling me what they need, and I have the Department of Defense telling me what it wants, and I have the FEMA and those agencies telling me what sort of resiliency they expect. They want us to be able to survive a greater than 64 earthquake and be back up and running within 5 days. And DOD says, oh, we want 2,200 feet of dock space. And Matson tells me, we want 4 100 gauge cranes. And so everybody tells me what they want. And of course, all of these things cost money. Well, if I look at the breakdown, I go, okay, I don't have this big pile of money. I have to get the money somewhere in order to build what you guys are asking me for. Where's the money coming from? Well, I have the private vendors, the Totes and the Matsons, saying, well, this is a business decision, and we think this is what we're willing to pay. So for instance, Matson has said, we'll pay for the cranes. You just have to build a dock that's wide enough to support the cranes. And, if you want to put a tariff on to widen the dock, go for it. But then DOD says, yeah, but we still need 2,200 feet of dock. And, FEMA says, yes, and that dock's got to withstand the 64 plus earthquake. And then you go, okay, well, I'm building this extra big dock that has extra deep piles, that has, all of these various things. Again, where's the money coming from? Well, I can't build what I can't afford. So what we need to do is we need to get everybody together and say, okay, what do you really want and what are you going to build? If I look at order of magnitude costs, I have a number of different types of costs. So I have what we'll call the failed expansion projects related repair costs. During the failed expansion project, they built a lot of new land because they were building this sheet pile wall and they added something like more than 50 acres of land to the port. Well, the problem is that sheet pile wall is not stable. It's on the verge of failing. So if we have a 64 size earthquake, it's going to fail and the material behind it's going to slide into the navigation channel. And then on top of that, it's in the way of where we want to put the new dock. So we have to remove that land that was constructed during the port intermodal expansion project of the early 2000s. That repair project is going to cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $250 to $350 million, depending on how much of the land we remove. And when I'm done with it, I'm not going to generate a penny of revenue from the fact that I did it. It's all a repair to repair damages that were done during the expansion project. Now, we're in litigation to get that money back from MARAD. MARAD is the U.S. Department of Transportation's Maritime Administration. MARAD was the project manager. They oversaw the project, and the municipality of Anchorage is saying, hey, you built it, you broke it, you buy it. And MARAD is saying, hey, no, it's not our problem, it's your problem because it's on Port of Alaska. So we're in that litigation. We think we have a good chance of winning. Our case is very good, but at soonest, it'll go to court next fall. So in the meantime, I've got $250 to $350 million of construction work that needs to be done that won't generate any revenue, and it needs to be done. So if I look at it, I can go, okay, if I'm looking at my overall project costs, I'm just using order of magnitude numbers now, somewhere in the neighborhood of 15% of my costs are going to be related to fixing problems created by the port expansion plan or project. I can say about 15% of my costs are going to be resiliency related. Things like having the extra deep piles, things like having extra thick steel, the improvements that will make the port more earthquake resistant. I can say about 15% of my costs are going to be for the first petroleum and cement terminal that I've actually started construction on. And I can say somewhere in the neighborhood of 55% of my costs are going to be for the general cargo docks and related infrastructure. So if that's how the costs break down, I go, okay, where are my funding sources come from? And I guess my proposal would be, well, it would be nice if we could get about 25% of our money from federal sources to pay for things like the extra dock that DOD wants and for the extra resiliency that FEMA and the disaster recovery folks want. And this is paying for services that basically I need to build, but that I won't generate any revenue from. I would suggest that somewhere in the neighborhood of 50% of our total cost ought to come from the state of Alaska. And it's paying for a number of things. It's paying for the DOD value that goes to the state. You know, the state of Alaska generates a tremendous amount of economic development because the bases are here. You know, for instance, all the construction work going on at Eielson Air Force Base right now for F-35s, that's benefiting the Fairbanks economy and the Alaska economy. And, you know, that economic development, I think, could fairly be covered by the state. It also would pay for the, I guess, the general economic development benefits and disaster response benefits that the port gives to the state. And then I would propose that the final 25% come from the Port of Alaska and fees and tariffs that are charged to the users here at the port. So, you know, the tonnage fees for material crossing the dock. The nice thing about that, or the problem, you know, we could come in and we could use a tariff to pay for all of the improvements that support commerce-related improvements. The problem is that wouldn't do anything to satisfy DOD, and it wouldn't do anything to satisfy FEMA and disaster response. But the bankers and the various bonding companies are not going to want to bond for those DOD and disaster response portions of the mission because they don't generate any revenue that can be used to pay the bond back. And that's our problem.
If it was just, what would the tariff impact be under that scenario?
Under which scenario?
In a ballpark where really it was just all private sector driven, is having the simplest terms.
If we were
supposed to an increased tariff on shippers.
And the scenario you're putting together is not, you know, there is nothing that says that Toten Matson couldn't move down the shore a quarter mile, rent some Alaska Railroad land, and build their own dock. The biggest thing that's going to keep them from doing that is they would have to pay for the dredging, which would be tremendously expensive. But they could go build a dock, and a dock that they would build would probably cost, well, shave 15% off for the, actually, basically, you can shave probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 30% off of the dock costs right away for resiliency and DOD missions. So they could build the dock, you know, at worst case, 70% of the cost of what we would build the dock. And if they were to build that dock, well, I guess a good example, we'll use the petroleum and cement terminal that we started construction on because we have a pretty good idea on what final numbers are for that dock. Even with the resiliency built into that facility, the bottom line impact on consumers is probably going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 5 cents per gallon of gas that you buy at the gas pump. You know, so is it enough to make you move out of the state? Probably not for most people, but is it enough to leave a mark? Absolutely. And if you spread that out for the entire dock, will it impact the Alaska Consumer Price Index? Yes, it will.
Okay, that's really what my question was.
Yeah, it will absolutely leave a mark.
It would move the needle and you'd notice it.
Yes, you would notice it. And it's going to depend on the product and how big a dock we build. You know, if we build to DoD standards and to FEMA standards, that's going to leave a bigger mark. Now, the other thing it's going to do is it's going to change the cargo shipping playing field. So, for example, if I have to raise my tariffs in order to pay for the new dock, what's going to happen is you're going to have two different types of shipper. You're going to have some shippers, say Fred Meyer shipping strawberries, that says, look, freshness is the issue here. I need to get the goods up here fast. Cargo ship takes 2.5 days to get them up here. I'm just going to add the extra fill in the blank, 20 cents for a pint of strawberries to the cost of the strawberries, and I'm going to keep selling fresh strawberries. On the other hand, if you're the Toyota dealer and you're looking at that tariff, you've got really heavy product that does not, it's not as time sensitive, you're going to go, I can bring it up on a barge that takes 10 days and I'll save some money. It'll cost more than today's current price, but it'll be cheaper than the tariff price that, post-construction or during the construction project. So what's going to happen then is two things. One, you'll pay a little bit more for your new car and you're going to have to wait 10 days. But the really important thing that happens is I still have to pay for that dock. And now I'm paying for it on a lower tonnage value. So your pint of strawberries isn't going to go up 20 cents. It's going to end up going up 50 cents. Because, the tariff on that smaller tonnage still has to pay for the dock repair. And that's where Alaska is really going to get wagged by it. Because we're going to feel it disproportionately on different products. So the public policy question that needs to be asked is, okay, if Alaskans are going to end up paying this cost because it's all inbound cargo and it stays in the state, what's the most efficient way to pay for it? Should we do it with a revenue tariff? A revenue bond that's paid with a tariff and is going to significantly shift the cargo playing field, or should we do it with some sort of broad-based tax, for instance, through a statewide general obligation bond, so that we don't goof up the cargo playing field or the competitiveness of various types of cargo. Alaskans pay it either way. It's just a question of which pocket you take it out of and how hard it is to get it out of that pocket. Any thoughts about that?
I was about to ask the same question. Gentlemen, lady. Carl.
So in talking, Jim, you're just talking about the Anchorage or Alaska port. And in the beginning, you said that 90% of our cargo comes up via marine.
Correct.
So in saying that, then, you have other ports out there that product are coming in. More specifically to the Alaska port is probably the produce. The heavier stuff would probably come in on the other ports. So how much?
Well, no, not exactly. Most of the goods that are coming into South Central Alaska, and that would include Fairbanks, are coming across our dock. When we're looking at total tonnage, a lot of that tonnage goes to places that are not connected to our road system. So Dutch Harbor, or it goes on a barge directly out to Nome. It goes to Kodiak, it goes down to Southeast. So that is a significant amount of tonnage coming into the state, but it's not coming to the road system. If you look at tonnage that's coming into the road system, you're primarily looking at Port of Alaska, Port of Whittier, and Port of Seward. Seward really has, while they could have some inbound cargo handling capacity, they don't have a lot now. They're primarily set up as a port for tour ships and for exporting coal. And Whittier gets most of its business by barge. It does not have a deep water dock, so it can't service container ships. It can only service barges. And the challenge is, both Whittier and Seward are connected to the road and rail system, but they have multiple single points of failure. So if we have the big earthquake, you can imagine, for instance, the Whittier tunnel closing, and it's completely cut off. You cannot get either by rail or truck goods from Whittier to the road system. Port of Alaska has more inbound cargo capacity than every other port in South Central Alaska combined. And unlike in the lower 48, part of the resiliency at, say, Port of Tacoma is the fact that there's a Port of Bellingham, a Port of Seattle, a Port of Portland. If for some reason Tacoma closes, there are lots of optional ports that you can go to that are on the road and rail system. Here in Alaska, not the case. And we don't have a big enough market to support those redundant ports.
But in saying that, you have a port that is in construction or in production right across the inlet. So are you even considering that?
Yes, that port is not an inbound cargo port, and that port has not handled a ship in, I believe it's 4, maybe 5 years now. The dock that is there is basically unusable during the winter because of the current speed and the ice flows. Ships will not dock there unless there's a tug standing by. And the design of the dock is meant for exporting wood chips. You can offload containers, but to offload even a single container ship with, for instance, we get 4 container ships per week that have about 600 containers per ship. And we get those on Sundays and Tuesdays. So if you're hearing noise behind me right now, it's because there are 2 container ships offloading. Today, Port of Alaska will offload about 1,200 containers, empty them out of the yard, and it will also load about 1,200 empty containers and ship them back out. And it will do all of that in less than 16 hours. In order to offload 1 container ship at the port across the way, Port McKenzie, you're probably talking a week and a half, just because of the type of dock. So even if a ship could, if you were in the summertime and a ship could efficiently or safely dock there, it would take a week and a half to offload and reload 600 containers.
Jim,
Yeah.
This is Bud Fate again. I want to revisit the financing, if you will.
Yeah.
Do you know of any specific federal statute that limits the ability of the federal government to contribute finances to a commercial endeavor, or whether or not a commercial endeavor actually can exist or can coexist, for example, with a military facility? And I have in mind that has occurred in the past. There was a place called Galena in the state of Alaska that had an airport that was completely military, that was used by the civilian people because it was the only airport there was in the entire vicinity. So it has happened before. And so I'm wondering if you're aware.
It has absolutely happened before. And as far as I know, there is no statute or law that prevents it from happening. The big difference is we are today in an earmark-free environment. Galena was built with earmarks. And same with a lot of the facilities at other DoD strategic ports. They were built and enhanced with earmarks, and right now there are not earmarks. Now DoD does have a program for doing certain construction projects at commercial ports or at commercial facilities. It's not only ports, it could be airports, it could be land facilities. Unfortunately, that program right now has not shut down, but there have been allegations of misspending over the past decade or so. And it's under incredible scrutiny, and they are not pumping much money into that program.
Thank you.
Yeah, there are mechanisms for doing it. It's just none of those mechanisms are funded right now.
It's possible.
Yeah.
Jim, one more question. You didn't mention the Port of Valdez.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Well, Port of Valdez is primarily an export facility. something about oil. I don't know. Now, and DOD actually uses Port of Valdez. That's how they bring most of their munitions in. Under statute, they can't bring them in through a population center like Anchorage. So when they're bringing munitions in for that end up in your neighborhood, those come across the Port of Valdez. But again, the facility is not built with the sort of efficiency, large cargo handling efficiency that Port of Alaska is built with. So it would be a really slow process. I haven't done the analysis for Valdez, but I can tell you that McDowell Group did a study that said, okay, let's pretend that Port of Seward had the exact same cargo handling infrastructure that we have here in Anchorage, so they could handle all the cargo that we have. Now, they don't have it, but let's say they did. Even then, it would add an average of 7.5 hours of travel time to every container brought into the state and every container leaving. So think about what the cost impact of adding 7.5 hours of driving and handling time to everything that you bring into the state would be. It would be significant. And that's assuming that we don't have the earthquake that, makes a bridge over the 6 Mile River fail, or, any of the other single failure points. And you guys aren't as familiar with it, but if you live in Anchorage and you've ever driven on the Seward Highway on, say, 4th of July weekend, and then you go, I wonder how much slower this would be if we added 1,200 containers. The local infrastructure just is not developed to handle that kind of capacity.
I'm not debating that one, that's for damn sure. But then you still have that option, and I think it's only barge that goes into Valdez, correct?
They can do some ships. It's mostly barge, though. And you do have that as an option. The problem is can they handle it in a timely fashion? So, 2,400 inbound containers a week, could they handle it? They're not set up for that, no.
And
you have single point of failure also.
I'm not debating that, but you keep referencing the earthquake, the next earthquake, and I'm just looking at that as an option.
Yeah, well, and the other thing to keep in mind, if we go back to the earthquake slide here, what did I just do? I goofed.
You went too far.
You went to the halls of Montezuma or something.
Yeah, exactly. Let me see if I can bring this back up here. So
we can still see your screen, though.
I'm sorry?
You just have to refire. You can still see your screen. You just have to refire up the presentation.
Yeah. There we go. Okay. So there, if you look at this tsunami map, so if you look at Valdez, they had according to this, a 30 to 40 foot tsunami with a 100-foot run up. So basically, the waves that hit Valdez and the Port of Valdez, would have wiped out, or did wipe out, the port. And that's your problem. You go, okay, because of the tsunami exposure to all of South Central Alaska, really the only two ports that are going to be in tsunami-proof territory are Port McKenzie, that really has no inbound cargo handling capacity, and Port of Alaska. Every other port is at risk for being wiped out by a tsunami. We all know what happened in Seward and Whittier. Valdez was less of a port at the time, so it didn't make as much news.
Okay. It looked like you had some slides near the end.
Oh, I was just, if people were, here, I'll go to it. So I was basically at this slide and just talking about the fact that Port of Alaska has plenty of space for expansion if the market grows. So we don't need to build a bigger port. We just need to build a port that will handle all the things we've just been talking about. And then I had this slide, which is basically our project slide. So if you look, you can see the existing docks where it says Terminal 1, Terminal 2, Terminal 3, and then POL stands for petroleum, oil, and lubricant. So that's a fuel dock. So on the right-hand side of that slide where it says petroleum and cement terminal, or the PCT, that's the dock that I showed you the picture of being constructed right now. That dock, we started the shoreside work on this summer. Our plan is to do all the dredging work next summer and then actually start constructing the dock itself in summer of 2020. So the in-water construction would be 2020 through 2021, and that will be our first dock. If you look at the left side of the screen, where all that yellow is, that is, we've broken our port intermodal expansion project repair work, if you will, into two projects. So basically, in order to make it into more financially digestible chunks, that yellow is what we need to pull out at a minimum in order to start constructing the new cargo terminals, just so that we have enough room to maneuver ships between the construction project and the shore and get them into the existing totes berth. Terminal 3 is the tricky one. In order to have tote be able to dock, they need to have a little more maneuvering room. So that land needs to go away.
And then the darker yellow would be where the new shoreline is?
Yes, that would basically, what they're going to do is replace the sheet pile wall with a riprap wall. You know, riprap is the classic piles of rock that you see. So basically what we'll do is we'll build in a more natural shoreline, and it will actually extend when we're done. If you look at the far left of the screen, you can see a dry barge berth. You see where the N for north is? Straight above that is our dry barge berth. So basically that yellow will extend all the way to, you can see the sheet pile wall on the right side of the dry barge berth. It will extend to the top of that sheet pile wall. All that land has to go away. It's something in the neighborhood of probably 25 acres. I don't know the exact size. They haven't gone out and exactly surveyed it, but it's right in the neighborhood of 25 acres. Will go away. So they'll dig all that out. If you need some really good fill, you know, we've got plenty of good gravel in there. I mean, I'm saying that, you know, to be funny, but the fact of the matter is, it's all gravel that was placed there, and it's actually high quality fill. So we're hoping we can find a good public construction project in the neighborhood that needs some fill, so that we can provide it in a cost-effective fashion while we're digging it out.
And then finally, the rest of the work we're talking about is in those berths, the Terminal 3, Terminal 2, Terminal 1.
That's right. And basically what's going to happen is when we're done, if we end up, assuming we build a DoD compatible dock, we will effectively rebuild the same amount of dock we have now, plus or minus 10 feet. The difference is it'll be about 400 yards south of where it is now. It'll start there with that yellow PCT, and it will be about 150 feet farther out into the ocean, so that we have deeper berths. The current berths are 35 feet deep at low mean water, and the new ones will probably be 45 feet in order to handle modern sized vessels. And we don't have a problem a lot. You can usually handle, for instance, a lot of tankers need 45 feet, or they need 42 or 43 feet anyway of depth. So what they'll do is they'll play the tides. They'll come in on an incoming tide, dock, hook up, start pumping like crazy, so that by the time low tide comes 6 hours or 8 hours later, they will have lightened their load enough that they don't need their full depth. You know, every now and then they goof up. We had a tanker earlier this fall that came in tied up. They had a mechanical where they couldn't start pumping right away, and the tide started going out, and they had to pull out and go hang on the hook, they call it, anchor up basically, out in the inlet until the tide turned, and then they had to push back in. And you go, okay, well, that's not a big deal. Well, it's not a big deal, except that it cost them probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $40,000 when you look at all the tug time and the longshoreman time and everything else. So it's not something you want to do if you can avoid it.
I guess my only final two questions, Jim. This is Jomo.
Mm-hmm.
First, we've kind of bandied about the number of about $1 billion for all of this.
In that neighborhood, yeah. Or I would say at least $1 billion. And that includes the construction or the repair project, basically removing all that land that was built as a result of the port intermodal expansion project that failed.
Okay. I guess my only further question would be, are we building for the future? You said running those docks out another 150 feet, getting it down to an average mean of about 40, 45 feet. How forward looking is that?
Well, that's a really good question. You know, the trick, we have a couple of tricks going on. Do we need to be able to service bigger ships for Alaska's current market? No. You know, the fact of the matter is, we're at 35% capacity, and the container ships that service us now are more than up to handling Alaska's market. The problem is the container ships that service us now are old, and they're the smallest ships that are providing regular container service on the West Coast. Both Tote and Matson, especially Tote, want to modernize their fleet so that they can be more efficient. And in the case of Tote, modernizing the fleet means building a ship that's quite a bit bigger than their current ships that our dock can't handle. Their problem is typical ships last about 30 to 35 years. Their ships are in the neighborhood of 35 years old. They're ready to be replaced, but they don't want to build new ships to our current standards. They want to build to the standards of the new dock. So they're really wanting us to get going so that they can build a bigger ship. Our dock cannot handle a bigger ship, both because of berth depth and because of crane size. The cranes aren't big enough to reach out over a wider ship. But Matson wants to use the bigger ships because it will be able to deliver cargo more efficiently. This dock will be designed for those ships. Are ships likely to get bigger in the future? You know, the thought in the industry is they've sort of maxed out. They're probably not going to get bigger because at some point it becomes inefficient to move around with too big of ships. In a small market out at the edge of the fringe, like we are, you know, they don't need to send the super big ships to us. So a 45-foot ship should be fine for us into the foreseeable future. If something happens and the state's population doubles and our demand for cargo doubles, you know, we're at 35% capacity now. That would bring us up to 70% if we doubled our material. We would still be fine. And if we decided we wanted to build more dock, well, we still have all that land on the north end that nothing says we couldn't build a new dock along there. It's just, you know, we would have to do it. So
that was fine. Again,
we're not building more dock, but I think the dock that we're talking about building will handle our market into the foreseeable future.
Okay. Again, is it $1.5 billion for another 30, 35 years, or are we talking $1.5 billion for the next 10? In which case, we probably want to.
And there's another question. You know, if we build to the resiliency standard that the FEMAs and the Departments of Homeland Security want us to build for, the dock will be constructed to last a minimum of 75 years and survive a 64+ earthquake. If we build to a commercial standard, that's probably more of a 35 to 50-year project. And the cost difference is somewhere in the neighborhood of 15%. So that extra resiliency, that extra, 25 years of service costs you an extra 15%.
But it seemed like it'd be well worth it.
Okay.
15% for another.
Yeah, I mean, and it comes down to a business decision. Okay, it seems like a good return on your investment to get an extra 25 years, basically 30% more lifespan for 15% additional money, but it only makes sense if you have the money in your pocket that you can spend. If you don't have the money, then it doesn't make sense.
But it seems like the adding the DoD spec to it, if you will, also justifies getting DoD to participate in the basic funding. So it seems like there's that aspect of this deal makes sense to me.
Well, you certainly won't get an argument from me on that front. The question is finding the federal connection that gets that money directed to us. And
Well,
you know,
I think when we did,
oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, say.
well, the bird in hand is the state's ability to bond.
Yep. Well, there are actually a couple of things. You know, the state can participate in a number of ways that makes our project more affordable. So, for example, if the state does the bond or the state does a contribution. So, for instance, last year the legislature contributed $20 million to the petroleum cement terminal that's under construction. You know, that is state participation that makes the project more buildable, because that $20 million is now $20 million that we don't have to do with a revenue bond. But the state can also significantly lower our costs by, for example, backing the bond, or in the case of the federal government, maybe they back the bond or they give the loan. And by doing that, that can reduce your interest rate considerably, that over the course of a 35-year or 40-year loan or bond payment, you know, that could save hundreds of millions of dollars by saving.
It's real money.
Yeah.
It's real money. That grant, that $20 million you spoke of from last year, was that a grant? So that was in the capital budget?
That was in the capital budget, yes. And that's the first new state money since the Port Intermodal Expansion Project. Now, there was money left over from the Port Intermodal Expansion Project that was state money that we have been using to do the design work and the early construction. So there was some money from that. Just to give you an idea of what we were talking about, the original Port Intermodal Expansion Project, basically what they wanted to do was all the way from that north end, they built the dry barge berth, and they wanted to extend that wall that the yellow is on all the way to the south end to where the petroleum cement terminal, the very right side of that petroleum cement terminal. So they would have more than doubled the size of our dock. You know, and okay, we're at 35% capacity now. What were you thinking the market was going to be to more than double our dock? You know, how were we going to cost justify that? Well, they weren't. They were just saying, hey, look, we have free federal money, let's spend it. I mean, it was not a well thought out plan, and it did not have real numbers associated with it.
We do appreciate your honesty, sir, because we know it.
Yeah, well, and it's silly to deny it. You know, we all know there are a number of Alaska projects that if they weren't built because they were economically generated or economically justified. They were built because Ted Stevens got us free federal money. But the fact that the Port Intermodal Expansion Project should never have been built does not take away from the fact that the existing Port of Alaska is a half-century-old facility that is, you know, dying a slow motion death of rust and corrosion, and that the whole state's economy is going to feel the impact when that happens.
Or if that happened, yeah. If it went to failure. Okay. Well, Jim, thank you very much. Ladies, gentlemen, are there any further questions?
No, just a thanks for a complete and understandable presentation.
Well, I
Yes,
hope that
thank
was
you.
useful.
So I assume that you guys are going to be heading back to the legislature come this spring.
I Yes, I am.
Okay.
We've actually had a fair number of legislators out at the dock this year. And, you know, I pretty much have, you know, it's really hard, including the governor-elect. Everybody who's been under the dock looks at it and goes, yep, we get it. This is a necessary piece of statewide infrastructure that needs to be replaced. This is not, you know, a build it and they will come project. We have, you know, a half-century track record of demonstrating the business model. We have not, you know, we have sustained ourselves for half a century. This facility does not take any taxpayer money for its operational budget. It's just for the capital budget of how do we replace the docks. And in fact, most of the docks that are existing were not built with taxpayer money. They were built with operational revenues.
Again, at this point, my only small critique is, you know, having just run a utility for a little while. You normally charge for O&M because you know this stuff is coming.
Right.
You know, we didn't charge for the M.
Yep.
For the M&R, maintenance and replacement.
And that has been a problem here also. And, you know, the reason that problem exists, probably the same reason that it exists with the utilities, is that we were in a market where, in the case of the utilities, if you need to build new infrastructure, well, you can raise the costs when it comes time. In the meantime, we want to have the lowest near-term costs. And at Port of Alaska, we did not put money in the bank because the thinking was, well, Uncle Ted will always get us the cash we need when we need to expand or rebuild or whatever.
So let's do lowest near-term costs and
that's right.
Greatest
and
benefit.
As a result, you know, frankly, if you compare our tariffs to most West Coast tariffs, we actually have pretty attractive tariffs. So when you look at shipping costs into Alaska, you're paying for the long boat ride that the goods are taking. The costs for using the port are actually very reasonable relative to most West Coast ports. That's probably going to change in the very near future. We're looking at tariff increases starting as soon as January in order to start paying for the new petroleum cement terminal. And, you know, as a result, prices are going to go up. Now, again, because the shipping tariffs are a relatively small portion of overall shipping costs, you're not going to notice wholesale changes, but, you know, your gallon of gas will get a little bit more expensive, and there's really no getting around that.
There's a disparity between what a gallon of gas costs in Anchorage and there is in Fairbanks.
Yeah.
So it simply means that you'll probably get parity with the cost as it comes in Anchorage, but you will not in Fairbanks.
Well, I think what's going to end up happening is if the cost of gas
$3 to bring it in, that's what the increase will be in Anchorage. It'll be 6 cents in Fairbanks.
Well, yeah, it'll be the same 3 to 5 cents increase everywhere that our gas goes. So I'm not sure how much of our gas or Fairbanks gas is coming from Anchorage right now.
Well, there's always been about a 10-cent differential or sometimes more between the cost of gasoline in Fairbanks and there is in Anchorage.
Yeah, and I think most of that comes down to the cost of getting it up to Fairbanks.
No, that's not true.
No,
it's not true at all. It's a market. It's the market.
Don't get in there, Jim.
Yep.
Yeah, don't do it, Jim. Let him ride.
Long way forward.
Yeah, no, I can believe that. But basically, everybody's going to have to at some point say, okay, the fuel that's coming across the dock is going to end up costing, 3 to 5 cents a gallon more. That's just the way it's going to be. Now, how that shakes out in the various markets, I don't know, because there are so many other factors. Hello?
Oh, no, we're still here. Well, Mr. Jager,
We're all thinking of the other factors.
Yeah.
Actually, we have one more question, Jim.
Sure.
Shepherd, I was down there with the Ocean Cluster Initiative.
Yeah. And thank you for, you're responsible for this happening, so thank you.
I'm glad it's timely and relevant, and thank you for giving such a succinct presentation again. My question is, given the scope of the impact and reach of these decisions, is there a broader collaborative group that is working on the financing portion of this? Are you tackling this single-handedly as the Port of Alaska, or have you established a...
Well, the mayor, certainly the municipality is...
Beyond the municipality.
Oh, did you catch that, Jim?
Yes, I did. Well, we just finished up. We had a group led by a company called Capson come in and do a plan of finance for us. We just got that report last week. And basically, they went through and analyzed our various financing options for the municipality, the port, and what the impact of various state and federal assistance could be, or the impact of public-private partnerships could be. You know, and the bottom line is, for instance, I've heard a lot of people, including the governor-elect, say, well, this is really a perfect situation for a public-private partnership, which I would agree that is part of the solution. The trick is, keep in mind that when private companies invest their money into a project, they expect to have a market rate return.
Private sector return.
So, you know, they are going to want to invest in the portions of the market that are making money, generating revenue, things like the container business. They're not going to be so interested in necessarily investing in resiliency or DoD mission, because that's not making any additional revenue for them. And when they're making their rate of return, it's got to be a market rate of return. So, you know, don't look for it to be significantly cheaper than if a government-backed organization does the same thing. In fact, in most cases, public money is less expensive than private money when it comes to, for instance, bonding. So the captain's suggestion was that the public-private partnership is probably appropriate for certain portions of the project, some of the cranes, for instance, or some of the infrastructure associated with petroleum and cement. It's probably not appropriate for some of the other portions of the project, for instance, the main put my tongue back in my mouth, the main container dock costs, you know, just because they are not going to want to build the same facility that we're going to want to build, we being the public.
No, I was just going to say, you know, given the impact, not just to the interior, to Alaska, to the state of Alaska, as well as the military impact, you know, there's also the emerging trade route configuration and potential impacts. There are a number of layers involved in this, and a number of stakeholders we may not even be taking into consideration. And it seems that broader group of stakeholders that could bring insight and suggestions, you know, to this process might be beneficial. And I'm just wondering if you've considered that.
Well, I mean, we have reached out and we've been dealing with quite a few stakeholders. I'm not going to pretend that we haven't missed any. I will tell you that one problem we have is we have our 10-year timeline till dock failure. That's assuming there's no earthquake. And we have a minimum of an 8-year construction project. So at some point, we can only talk about it so much longer, and we just need to start moving forward. And we should not let perfection be the enemy of serviceable. You know, and that's why the mayor made the call, for example, that we are starting construction this year on the petroleum and cement terminal. Even though we don't have full financing figured out, we don't have time to wait for the perfect answer. That said, we are talking to everybody we can think about to bring them into coalitions to help figure out how to fund this thing.
Thank you.
Well, Jim, again, thank you very, very much. Very much appreciated. And we will probably have you back around if you're willing as we move into the spring.
Absolutely.
To get an update. Yep, get an update regarding this specific project as far as the petroleum and cement terminal, but also your efforts to achieve that funding.
Absolutely, we'll be happy to, and perhaps next time I'll come up so that I can actually see you. And that way, if you want to throw rotten tomatoes at me because I'm saying things you don't like, I'm a better target.
Well, I was just going to say, let me know if you mentioned your boy coming up for skiing. Yeah, if you've got a spring skiing trip we are going to be coming up, we'll schedule for then.
All right, we can absolutely do that.
Love to have you.
All right, thank you.
Well, thank you, sir. Pardon?
I was going to say it was very nice speaking to you, gentlemen and ladies.
Well, I wonder, Jim, can you hand back control?
Well, I don't know. Let's find out.
Learning new tricks today.
Okay, I'm going to put the control thing over to you. What do you think? New share?
Yeah, try the new share again.
So I'm going to turn share off. Nope, nothing happened. Oh, stop share. There we go.
Okay.
Is that back to you?
Looks like it. Really, I just wanted to stop the recording.
Oh.
Tell you what, just go ahead and shut the meeting down, and we should be fine.
Oh, here's stop recording right here.